This video is brought to you by Slate Black Industries. For grips and accessories, visit slateblackindustries.com.
Welcome to 9-Hole Reviews. Earlier this year, we published a video demonstrating various white lights and their performance capabilities on a constructed course. Although that course was laid out to demonstrate some specific attributes of the tested tools and was in no way a comprehensive look at the totality of what makes a weapon-mounted light effective, we maintain that in general, a white light is a critical component for a firearm setup for real-world applications for most users. The buy-in price for a quality white light seems to start somewhere in the $100 range, and as such is an accessible item for most firearm owners to add to their weapon, even if their build is more budget conscious. But what if we explore a different way to see and identify things in the dark? Night vision devices have been used by armed forces for many years, all the way back to World War II if you'd believe it, albeit in a much cruder form than what we have access to today. But in the last decade or so, we've seen a proliferation of night vision devices in the hands of the civilian populace here in the US. With that said, the price to get into a quality Gen 3 night vision device is somewhere in the $2,000 to $3,000 range minimum for a PVS-14 monocular, with dual tube units starting around $6,000 up to the $12K range or more. So, while these devices are becoming more popular, keep in mind that this is a major financial commitment we're talking about. That's also just for the goggles, and not the spectrum of other accessories which are needed to use the units effectively. And on the accessory front is where we're hoping to assist in terms of providing a comparison today. We're going to be performing an effectiveness demo of civilian-class lasers and illuminators, or more specifically, lasers and illuminators civilians can purchase from retailers. Now, what are these devices and why are they important? Well, before we can answer that question, we need to first understand at a very high, non-technical level how modern night vision goggles work. A night vision device amplifies photons of light. Keyword here being amplifies and not generates or creates, meaning light must exist in an area in order for the night vision device to work. This may be light coming from the moon or stars, glow of light in urban areas, or an illumination tool which introduces light to an otherwise dark area. But unlike the human eye, night vision devices can detect near-infrared light. This means that instead of using a visible white light to add illumination for the image intensifiers to pick up, IR light can be introduced, which would only be visible to those wearing night vision goggles. Moreover, specific IR pointers, much like a visible laser pointer but on the IR spectrum, can be used as a finite point for aiming, since aiming passively through a red dot can be difficult when wearing goggles. This leads us back to the IR lasers and illuminators we're going to be demoing. These devices are, just as described, basically flashlights and/or laser pointers. And without getting into the weeds, when we describe the devices we're going to look at today as those which civilians can purchase on the retail market, we're basically saying that we're limiting our view to devices you can go online and buy from general commercial websites right now, because military-grade devices above a certain power threshold sold within the US are actually restricted by the FDA. Okay, with us so far? Now, before we turn on these devices and demonstrate them on our course, we need to talk about one further functional element of looking through and using night vision goggles, since it's an integral part of what you're going to see and what we'll be testing. As we established, NVGs work by amplifying light. The more consistently spread and even the light is across your field of view, the more evenly exposed of an image you'll see. This is also true in the inverse. So in a dynamic environment where things aren't perfectly and uniformly dark, or light for that matter, and light sources exist, such as street lights or security lights on buildings, the goggles will focus on those sources, and even if very dim to the naked eye, may appear extremely bright under NVGs. The result is similar to if you were to observe a bright light without goggles on. You'd see that light in the areas that light is touching, but your ability to perceive areas in shadow or beyond the light source would actually be degraded compared to if the light weren't there at all. Through goggles, you experience the same effect. Those darker areas in shadow will generally appear even darker than if the light source was not present at all. The light source in those instances is sometimes described as a photonic barrier. This is a major element which users of night vision need to be able to overcome, since it specifically limits what and where you can see, and one of the best ways to do so is to introduce an even more powerful light into the dark areas with the use of IR illuminators to overpower competing light sources. Our course today will be twofold. First, we'll demonstrate the power of these devices on a 25-meter target in a natural outdoor environment under what was a full moon with a relatively clear sky. Next, we'll introduce a diffused white light putting out less than 500 lumens between us and the 25-meter target, which places that target and its firearm in shadow, and demonstrates how the IR devices allow the user to either see that target or not. The light was not particularly bright, and this is what it looked like to the naked eye. Had we put the target directly behind the light or pointed the light back towards our position, the effect you see would only have been heightened. We'll then repeat this test at a further distance of 75 meters. First, without any other artificial light, and then by introducing the same white light and shadowing our target and its firearm. Again, here is what the course looked like without looking through the NVGs. We'll cycle through the various modes of each device tested and show you how those looked. This comparison will look at some of the most popular brands of IR devices one might consider running today, but is not comprehensive. All of these devices were purchased by us for testing, and it's simply prohibitive for us to try and secure every single option from every brand. If your favorite isn't here, it's not for any specific reason. Lastly, we want to reiterate that this is one very basic demonstration under a specific set of conditions. This is not the end-all comparison, and a device's performance in this test is not necessarily indicative of how that device might perform across other types of tests. Further, we are not night vision experts in either the equipment or the tactics realms. So, with that said, let's get on with it. First up on our 25-meter target is the DBAL I2. This is the most economic option that we're going to be looking at, available somewhere around the $700 to $800 range. The laser-only options that we're looking at here, low now into high, are both perfectly sufficient. High gets a little bit more bloom going on the target, but that's not too much of an issue. As you can see, the low-level illuminator really doesn't do very much. Now, again, we're only at 25 meters here, and this is in ideal conditions with no real spill from other light sources. Thankfully, with the high illumination mode that we have here, we are able to obviously identify the target. That's not going to be the case with every product we look at, so keep this in mind for comparative purposes. Next up, we're going to be going up the price ring in the DBAL offering. This is the DBAL A3. The laser option is effectively identical to what we got out of the I2 for both low and high settings. In fact, the low-level illuminator mode is also about the same as we had in the I2, which is that it is basically ineffective at allowing us to really do anything with it at the 25-meter mark. However, one thing that we were particularly surprised by is when we clicked on the illuminator to the high setting, which is what you're seeing here with no pointer, there's really very little illumination downrange, and if anything, it's a bit lopsided. So to the left of the pointer, we were noticing a bit of extra illumination, but it's still very ineffective. The head on the A3 is focusable, but as we focused it out, we realized that the pattern that we were displaying was actually the tightest pattern possible. So a bit ineffective. Up next is the ATPIAL. This is from L3. You'll notice that the laser mode, just like the laser mode on the other devices we've looked at so far, is perfectly sufficient for giving a nice bright point of aim. The illuminator here, as you can see, is definitely brighter than what was on the A3, about in line with what we got on the I2, but oddly enough, it had a petri dish looking effect. It was not a consistent look of illumination. And yes, we confirmed that the lenses were cleaned. So overall, does it illuminate the target? Yes, but again, with a bit of an odd display of that illumination power. Next up, we have the Zenico PERST Gen 3. This is a commercially purchasable device, so we've included it despite it having a more powerful laser than the other US Class 1 devices we're looking at. We have the laser set at an appropriate level during this demo, but we will showcase the full power nature of the laser in a minute. You'll notice that the illuminator works nicely in terms of power, better than the other devices we've seen so far. I do want to get out in front of this straight away. The lack of centering of the IR designator within the cone of illumination is completely on us. It could be more appropriately centered here. Simply had made some adjustments to the designator while we were on range and did not take out the tool to adjust the illuminator head, so apologies for that. This is the Surefire M300 Vampire head. And then we're going to take a look at the PERST Gen 4, which is an IR designator only, and the M600 Vampire. The PERST Gen 4, again, laser-only module, does have that enhanced power as mentioned on the 3. You can see the massive amounts of bloom from the laser when it's on high. It is insufficient to use on its own without an illuminator in terms of IDing the target. But paired with the Surefire M600, we get a very solid amount of illumination and a finite aiming point when the laser is appropriately adjusted for the distance that we're aiming. Even with the Surefire on, the high laser mode was blooming too much on the 25-meter target. Next, we have our third Steiner product. This is the DBAL D2. This unit is significantly larger than the I2 and A3, with the added girth coming from the illuminator unit. This illuminator unit is much more powerful than those on the other DBALs, and you can see the results. It's also focusable, and we're demoing it in 3 positions: loose, optimal, and tight. You can see that the tightest on high settings is bright enough to almost completely wash out the target at 25 meters. The IR pointer is about equivalent to what we saw on the other DBAL products. Quick conclusion on this one: for the price point being similar to the ATPIAL and the A3, the D2 is significantly more functional from a raw output or performance perspective, but comes with it added size and weight. And now for the BE MEYERS C1 Plus, the most expensive device we're going to be looking at, but as you'll see, one that comes with a massive advantage on the power spectrum. The first setting, flood or CQB, works great for indoors, but is relatively ineffective at this 25-meter target. However, as soon as we click into that medium setting, you can see immense amounts of light being cast downrange onto our target, with a decent amount of flood as well into the surrounding areas. Contrast that against this final setting, which is high or ultra, and you can see the difference basically coming from the amount of flood we're able to get in and around the target. Now let's introduce some shadow downrange and see how our devices perform. Starting again with the I2, the laser settings are still sufficient in both low and high to see the pointer, although high feels a bit better with some bright objects also downrange. The low illuminator mode, much like before, is just not sufficient within the confines of these conditions to be relevant. High illuminator is significantly better, and with this device, we were able to get a glimpse of the target and the rifle downrange, even if it wasn't optimal. Next, on to the A3. Same story with the laser modes as with the I2. The laser is quite obvious and easy to pick up. On the illumination modes, however, what was pretty unusable without the white light is now completely ineffective. We can't really even see the illuminator, never mind use it to PID the target or the weapon downrange. As you can imagine, with this device failing now, the 75 meter tests are only going to be more of the same. To be honest, we were quite underwhelmed with this performance and quite surprised. The ATPIAL-C looks just like the other devices in terms of the laser mode, perfectly sufficient. And when we clicked into the illuminator mode, despite being inconsistent, we were able to get some decent illumination on the target. Although the ATPIAL's cone of illumination appears to be decently sized, there do appear to be hotter spots within the cone, especially towards just left of center that we noticed as we dragged the illuminator across the target in these conditions. When we get to the PERST Gen 3, you'll see that there is a fairly significant difference in the amount of illumination being put out, and unlike the first three devices, it has enough power to obviously illuminate the target through the power of the white light downrange. We can clearly see the target, and we can see the weapon. As mentioned, the edges of the PERST cone of illumination are very precise and don't have any flooding effect. When we contrast this against the Surefire Vampire M300, you'll notice that there's a more obvious flooding effect, which makes seeing the peripheral area around the target a bit easier with equal effect on the target itself as compared to the PERST. The laser units on both the PERST 3 and PERST 4 appear effectively identical. In comparing the M300 to the M600 Vampire, we can maybe see a little bit of a power difference under these conditions, but not really. Both appear to work effectively at this range. With respect to the PERST Gen 4, the laser looks crisp and sharp in conjunction with both devices, regardless of the power setting. It definitely does not need to be on the full power mode at these ranges. Now let's hop over to the DBAL D2. The laser only is, again, sufficient as expressed throughout this session, and the illuminator, as expected, is extremely effective at defeating the white light and giving very obvious illumination on the target when focused to our preferred mid-level position. Even when completely loose, we did feel like we were getting sufficient illumination to see the target and weapon, and when we tightened it up, it was almost overkill. Very relevant to note is how the more powerful illuminator causes contrast of the image. So we get a hyper obvious identification of the target, very bright, but when compared to the weaker illuminators, we actually see less of the peripheral area around us. That's because we are, in effect, creating our own set of shadows based on the direction of our illuminator source. Lastly, we have the MAWL. The MAWL's CQB setting was completely ineffective in this instance, as anticipated, but the mid-level settings worked extremely well for this target under these conditions. The MAWL's mid-tier setting also helps to eliminate some of the effect we were just describing regarding applying a self-limitation on your field of view based on the intensity of the illuminator. Notice how the mid setting has a hotspot, but also throws some softer spill out. Contrasted against the high setting, which is the ultra hotspot mode only. Now it's time to move downrange to the 75 meter target. We're starting with no other light sources downrange to set ourselves a control. First up, the I2. Straight away we noticed the higher laser setting seemed better at this distance. The low setting, while still visible, was quite fine and a bit easier to lose. The low illuminator setting was ineffective at this distance, and the high setting was also not great. While we could see the illumination ring, we really weren't getting any power to ID on the actual target, especially compared to some of the other devices we're about to demonstrate. As you may have guessed, based on how the DBAL A3 has been doing, well, the illuminator was basically useless at this distance, even without any other light sources to compete with. We couldn't even tell it was active and had to flash the 25 meter target array to make sure we had the settings on the device set correctly. Now, the aiming laser was effective and visible at that distance, but if you aren't able to PID, is the ability to place the aiming device on the target relevant? Well, perhaps for the purposes of designating an area, but in the context of aiming and firing, most likely not. The ATPIAL-C performed very similar to the I2, based on everything we could tell. We could see the cone of illumination was there, but it just didn't have the juice to get us any real advantage in terms of identifying the target or the weapon at the target's base. Again, the IR laser was perfectly reasonable to point and aim at that distance. And now on to the PERST Gen 3. This was the first device that we felt gave us adequate ability to PID at this range. And frankly, the illuminator could actually be dialed up even to an additional level of power from where we had it set for the duration of this test if we needed to punch through even further. Next, we fired off the M300 Vampire with the PERST Gen 4 laser. At this distance, the flooding effect of the M300, while still allowing us to see the target, was less effective than we would have liked, especially considering how amazing it looked at the 25-meter target. The amount of actual illumination on target was about the same as what the PERST Gen 3 was able to deliver, but the Surefire still manages to achieve far more spill if that's something that's relevant to you one way or the other. With the PERST Gen 4, we've seen numerous claims online that it can be used as an illumination tool when turned up since it's so bright. So we tested that theory. As you can see, it's completely ineffective as an illuminator. The bloom simply washes out the target completely. Based on this testing, we would not recommend this route. That said, when paired with the M300 or the M600, it seems quite effective. Again, we didn't notice any real material difference between the M300 and M600, even at the 75-meter line, whether discussing the hot spot at the middle of the beam or the spilling areas. And now the big boy devices. The DBAL D2 absolutely rocked at this distance, especially showcasing the power of the focusable head. When dialed all the way in, you can see that the target is obviously illuminated and the rifle is clearly visible. Even at the optimal mid setting, whether on low or high mode, we could see what was happening downrange. With the focus backed all the way off, at this distance, we felt like we weren't getting quite enough power on the target to make the same claims though. With that said, you can see the advantages of this particular device and the illuminator module. This is an obvious advantage over all of the other devices we've looked at, but again, does come with it a sizable weight and signature difference with respect to how it sits on the rifle. And lastly, the MAWL. Just as with the closer targets, the CQB setting obviously wasn't going to be doing anything for us. Again, that's designed for inside of rooms, the same way a diffuser cap on some of the other devices might be leveraged. The mid setting worked out quite well for us though, with the target clearly illuminated, and the high setting was very similar to the focus beam on the D2. Basically the same size and what appeared to be similar power. Again, with the added benefit of being able to be activated with a button click rather than having to adjust and focus the emitter. Now we added in our light source to throw our targets into shadow. We're going to cycle through all the devices one more time to show you the performance. As anticipated though, the devices that were already struggling were simply ineffective under these conditions. That goes for the I2, the A3, and the ATPIAL, which really weren't able to get past the shadows created by our light source. Obviously, the IR designators or the aiming lasers are still effective under these conditions for those devices, but as previously mentioned, we aren't able to PID the targets. Of those three different devices, our belief is, having looked through the actual goggles on site, that the I2 actually had the best ability to illuminate, although again, ultimately being ineffective. Now, I do want to talk just a little bit more about the A3's performance, since, frankly, it was ineffective from an illuminating capability perspective. We ensured that fresh batteries were in the device. We also ensured that the illuminator's head was appropriately focused and cleaned of any sort of carbon or other debris that might have been impacting the performance. Now, this particular device that we tested, and granted this is a sample size of one, was manufactured several years before the i2 and the D2 that we had in this demonstration as well. But it was within the realm of what we would have expected to perform absolutely within its full functional capability, and that's simply not what we saw, or at least compared to what we have seen in terms of other photos or videos online. So again, take that as you will. And the same goes to a degree for the ATPIAL-C. We ensured that the illuminator was cleaned and clear of any sort of carbon or debris. Nothing should have been impacting the ability of the laser to output the illuminating capabilities of this particular device, yet again we see a very lopsided shape within the illuminator. We've seen other photos and videos online where the device certainly emits a more consistent beam, but in terms of power, this is still probably a fair assessment in terms of what you should expect. And now on to the PERST Gen 3. What we're going to demo quickly here is the difference between using the bloom of a laser or attempting to use the laser's bloom to illuminate a target compared to an actual cone of illumination. As you'll notice, the laser is just insufficient to appropriately PID the target. When we fire on the illuminator, we can obviously see the target even through the light source that is downrange. I will add that if you're feeling a bit underwhelmed by this particular illuminator, especially compared to, say, like the D2 or the MAWL, we did have it, again, set at a mid-level setting. If anything, that's a user error-based issue. I want to be clear that it could theoretically go brighter if you feel like it needed an extra little bit of juice to be able to ID something at this range. And I do want to reiterate that the illuminator is zeroable within the confines of getting it to center around the IR designator or aiming point. Although we did not have it perfectly set for this test, we were and have since been able to adjust that using the tool that actually is included within the front or the head of the PERST Gen 3. The Surefire Vampires were the first devices we felt we were really able to use to overpower the white light. But there was an obvious and noticeable difference compared to when there was no competing light sources in play. This feels like it was probably on the edge of where these specific devices would allow us to be effective in identification. As we've said many times now, the laser pointer really hasn't been the limiting factor, and the PERST 4, being a full power unit, while cool, wasn't really of consequence in terms of the parameters of this test. And as we dialed up the laser, it is worth noting that even with a very, very bright illuminator in the Surefire Vampire, we were still getting massive amounts of bloom on the target, such that it would really actually be prohibitive in us being able to have a finite aiming point dependent upon the distance. The DBAL D2 was able to defeat the light, but we felt it was only able to do so with either the higher of the power modes or if we focus the illuminator into the hottest position. So the low illum mode with the optimal head position wasn't quite enough for us here. That felt in line with what we were getting out of the Surefire Vamps. So as mentioned, on high power or focused or both, the D2 was still clearly effective under these conditions. Now, we haven't spoken about this yet since we are almost purely focused on the performance of the devices, but I have designated whether the illuminators are either LED-based or laser-based in the top left-hand corner of the screen. What we've identified here is that the laser-based illuminators, with the exception of the MAWL, are just massively underpowered, because they are Class 1, in comparison to the LED illuminators. With that said, the LED illuminators do have one small disadvantage, which is that they do have a small visible signature. That is a very, very slight red glow if the target is staring directly back into the device. That red glow looks really like nothing more than a small red dot off in the distance, but it is there, so it's something to take into consideration. And we'll round things out with the MAWL. The MAWL on mid or high mode was capable at this distance, with high mode being our preferred option to PID through the shadows created downrange. Mid mode was okay, but we couldn't make out the firearm quite as easily on the mid setting. Now, there are simply too many possible factors for us to provide you with a conclusion of what you should do based on these results. But what you're seeing here is indicative of exactly what we saw looking through goggles on the range. Here are our primary takeaways. The main difference between most commercial devices is the illuminator and not the laser. In fact, the civilian class lasers were more than acceptable and were not the limiting factor per our analysis. The full power lasers were absolutely overkill within the 100-meter bay we worked in for this test. With respect to the illuminators, some of the most popular devices are frankly ineffective for anything outside 25 meters. Within the more budget-conscious popular options, the DBAL I2, despite being the cheapest unit tested, actually performed, in our opinion, the best. But the IR version has no vis laser, which can be annoying for the purposes of zeroing. Self-contained units that are effective out to the 75 meter and beyond are limited to only 2 or 3 choices. Splitting to a standalone IR illuminator like the Surefire Vampire outside of a contained unit may open possibilities for more budget-conscious options which are effective, but then controls for the laser illuminator may become more cumbersome. And that will conclude this session. We want to give specific thanks to Ben over at Spiritus Systems for his help in discussing the layout of this test, the parameters, and some of the information shared regarding the context of using goggles in dynamic environments. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, we'll see you on the range.
Subscribe to our newsletter at slateblackindustries.com, where you can get updates on 9-hole review publications and access the Practical Accuracy Scoreboard to help you argue with people on the internet on which rifle performed better on the Practical Accuracy course. We maintain this newsletter to be majority gun content, with 9-hole reviews updates per every email, with less than 33% marketing content. Subscribe today on slateblackindustries.com.
716, this is Steel Knight 6, 4 Vic, 8 packs, Redcon 1, green to green, how copy, over?
Steel Knight 6, this is 716, roger, over. 16, Steel Knight 1, 1 pack, green, over. This is 716, roger, over.
16, Steel Knight 2, 1 Victor, 2 packs, Redcon 1, over.